He was typing her rejection into the software she wrote. That was the detail no one in the room knew yet. Not the hiring manager. Not the 2 HR coordinators flanking him. Not the woman sitting across the glass-topped table in a gray blazer and natural hair who had spent 40 minutes answering questions she had been answering variations of for 15 years. His fingers moved across the keyboard. The interface glowed on the screen facing him. The clean dashboard, the applicant tracking fields, the drop-down menus that populated automatically when he selected a candidate disposition. He had used this software every working day for 3 years. He found it reliable, intuitive. He had once told someone at a conference that it was the best ads platform on the market. He selected. Candidate does not meet minimum technical requirements. He looked up. He said, "I have to be honest with you. The role is highly technical, and we have concerns about your background." What he did not know, what he had no mechanism to know, because he had never thought to look, because the question had never occurred to him, was that the drop-down menu he had just used, the dashboard behind his screen, the underlying architecture of every workflow his HR team ran through this software, had been designed by the woman sitting across from him. Her name was Josephine Aladi. And she was going to let him finish his sentence. 12 years earlier. This is where it starts. Josephine had grown up in Houston, the second of 4 children born to a Nigerian engineer named Samuel, who had come to the United States for a graduate degree and stayed for the work, and a Texas-born English teacher named Claudette, who had grown up understanding that the sharpest tool a person could carry was the ability to make themselves understood. The combination had produced children who were technically rigorous and linguistically precise, which was its own particular form of dangerous competence, the kind that rooms underestimated until they were well inside it. Josephine had studied computer science at UT Austin. She had been one of 6 black women in a department of 400. And had dealt with this the way she dealt with most structural obstacles, by becoming undeniably excellent, and letting the excellence do the work that argument never reliably did. She had graduated in 3.5 years. She had turned down 2 job offers from larger firms to join a 4-person startup called Meridian Software. Because the founder, a woman named Dr. Chen Liwei, was building something that Josephine had immediately recognized as genuinely interesting. A human resources technology platform that used behavioral data modeling to reduce unconscious bias in applicant tracking. The irony of what that software would one day be used to do to Josephine herself was not lost on her. She had thought about it, years later, with the specific dark humor of someone who understands how systems work, and understands equally that even well-designed systems operate inside imperfect human institutions. She had been at Meridian for 7 years. She had risen from junior engineer to lead architect. She had been the primary designer of the platform's core tracking and disposition engine, the module that managed candidate flow, automated workflow triggers, and generated the analytics that Meridian's sales team used in every pitch deck. She had also been the architect of the bias reduction scoring layer that had been the platform's most cited feature in 3 consecutive industry reports. The platform was called ClearPath HR. By the time Josephine left Meridian, ClearPath had 63 enterprise clients and was the dominant mid-market ads platform in the southwestern United States. She had left Meridian not because she was pushed, but because she was ready to build something different. She had spent 18 months developing an idea for a predictive workforce modeling tool, a system that went upstream from hiring and helped organizations understand the structural conditions that determined who they hired, not just how they processed applications. She had taken that idea to 3 investors. 2 had passed. 1 had funded it, a $2.2 million seed round, enough to build a team and a prototype. The prototype had not become a product. Not because the idea was wrong. Dr. Mensah, who had advised her through the early development stage, told her years later that the idea was 5 years ahead of its time, which was the kind of assessment that is simultaneously a compliment and a sentence. It had not become a product because the market wasn't ready for it, and Josephine had the financial discipline to recognize when to stop building something that nobody was yet able to buy. She had wound down the company at the end of year 2. She had spent the following 3 months evaluating her options with the same precision she applied to everything. She was 41 years old. She had a decade of senior engineering experience, a primary architectural credit on a platform used by 63 enterprise clients, a failed startup whose failure had taught her more than most successes, and a daughter named Zara who was 8 and needed a parent who was present in the specific, sustained way that product development sprints and investor calls had made difficult. She had decided to find a senior technical role at an established company, not as a retreat, as a choice. The industry had a category for this and called it various things, none of which she found particularly accurate. She called it doing the next right thing. She had applied to 12 positions. She had received 7 callbacks. She had reached the final interview stage at 4 companies. This was the 4th. NextBridge Analytics was a mid-sized data services firm in Dallas. They were hiring a director of product architecture, a role that required, per the job description, 8 or more years of enterprise software design experience, demonstrated leadership of technical teams, and familiarity with HR technology platforms, which was listed as a preferred qualification. Preferred, not required. She had more than preferred. She had built the platform they were using. The hiring manager's name was Greg Sutton. He was 48 years old, 17 years at NextBridge, and the kind of manager who had been in his role long enough that the role had shaped him more than he had shaped it. He was not a bad man. He was a thorough man. In certain respects, he researched candidates, prepared questions, ran structured interviews. He had a process, and he followed it. The process had a gap. The gap was in what the process was designed to surface and what it systematically missed. Greg Sutton had been using the same interview framework for 9 years. He knew what a technical candidate looked like, because he had been hiring them for a decade, and had formed, across that decade, a specific and unexamined image of what the pattern was. The schools, the trajectories, the company names, the particular confident fluency of someone who had moved through the industry the way the industry expected people to move through it. Josephine Alade's resume fit the qualifications. It did not fit the pattern. Not because of anything she had done or failed to do. Because the pattern was a pattern. It reproduced itself. It recognized itself. It rewarded the things that resembled it and flagged the things that didn't. And the things that didn't were often the things that a more careful look would have identified as the most significant of all. He had noted in his pre-interview read of her file that she had left a senior role at a startup that had wound down. He had noted the 2-year gap between ClearPath and NextBridge's opening. He had not noted, because he had not looked for it, because it had not occurred to him to look, that the ClearPath HR platform was the same platform installed on his workstation, the same platform he used every single working day, the same platform whose lead architect credit was sitting in the second section of her resume under the heading she had titled, with characteristic precision, Core Technical Contributions. He had read the heading. He had not read the name beneath it. He ran the interview by his process. 40 minutes. 12 structured questions. He was professional and consistent, and he asked the same questions he always asked, and he listened for the same signals he always listened for, and he found in Josephine Alladay's answers. A competence that was evident, and a manner that was assured, and something else. Something in the texture of her responses. The specificity and the confidence in the way she answered technical questions, not with approximations, but with precision. That should have been the clearest possible signal. It was not the signal he was listening for. At minute 37, he made his decision. At minute 40, he communicated it. He said, "I have to be honest with you. The role is highly technical and we have concerns about your background." He said it gently. He had developed across 17 years of hiring the specific gentleness of someone who delivers bad news frequently and has learned to deliver it in a way that minimizes friction. He was not being unkind. He was being efficient. Josephine looked at him. She had been waiting for this sentence the way you wait for something you've heard variations of for 15 years. Not with shock, not with resigned despair, but with the particular focused attention of someone who knows what comes next and has already decided what to do with it. She had decided, sitting in that chair with the glass-topped table between them, that she was going to let him finish the sentence. And then she was going to show him something. She said, "I understand. Before you finalize that, would you mind if I showed you something on your screen?" Greg Sutton paused. It was an unusual request. His process did not include this step. He was also in the specific way of a person who has just delivered a rejection they feel confident about. Slightly off balance, the request had come without defensiveness, without visible frustration, with the calm directness of someone who knows exactly what they're about to say. He turned his monitor. Josephine leaned forward. She pointed, not to the candidate disposition field, though she could see it, her name in the drop-down and the rejection code beside it. She pointed to the bottom right corner of the ClearPath interface, where the software version numbers sat in gray text beside a small icon. "Could you click that icon?" she said. Greg Sutton looked at the icon. He had worked with this software for 3 years and had never once clicked that icon. He clicked it. The software's About panel opened. Version information. License details. And at the top, in standard display text, ClearPath HR Platform, V4, 2-core architecture, lead design, Josephine A. Allad Meridian Software, 2014-2021. The room was completely still. One of the HR coordinators made a sound that was not a word. Greg Sutton looked at the screen. He looked at Josephine. He looked at the screen again, with the specific attention of a man reading something he is not fully processing, because what it means requires a recalibration that his brain is running faster than his expression can keep pace with. He read her name on his monitor. Her name. On the software he had described at a conference 3 years ago as the best ATS platform on the market. Josephine waited. She had learned the value of letting moments land fully before speaking into them. "You designed this," he said. Not a question. The voice of a man confirming. "I was the lead architect on the core tracking and disposition engine," she said, "including the module you're using right now." She paused. The bias reduction scoring layer in version 3.0 was also mine. It won the HR Tech Innovation Award in 2019. Greg Sutton's jaw was set. Not in anger, in the particular muscular tension of a man whose face is managing something his professional composure is not yet equipped to manage. He looked at the candidate disposition field. Her name. The rejection code. He looked at the About panel. He looked at the resume on his desk that he had spent 17 minutes reading and had not read carefully enough. He said, "I need to. I'd like to take a moment." "Of course," Josephine said. He took 3 minutes. The HR coordinators were very quiet. One of them, a young woman named Keisha, who had been at Nextbridge for 8 months, and was sitting with the particular expression of someone watching something she intends to remember for the rest of her career. Looked at the resume on the table, and then at the screen, and then at Josephine, with the specific expression of a person doing the math, and finding that the math had been obvious all along. When Greg Sutton looked up, his face had settled into something that was not quite the professional smoothness of before. Something more honest. The particular expression of a person who has just understood the precise nature of their own mistake. "I owe you an apology," he said. "I reviewed your materials and I missed something material. Something that was plainly there." He stopped. He said the harder thing, and I want to acknowledge that I don't think that was an accident of thoroughness. I think I was looking for something specific, and I wasn't seeing what was actually in front of me. Josephine looked at him. She let that sit for 2 seconds. "Thank you," she said. She meant it, not warmly, not as absolution, but as the acknowledgement of something accurate having been said. She said, "I'd like to continue the interview if you're willing. I think there's more worth discussing." Greg Sutton was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Yes, I think there is." The interview ran another 37 minutes. Not because Greg Sutton was making up for lost time, though there was something of that. The quality of attention a person gives when they understand they have been inattentive. But because the 37 minutes were genuinely useful. Josephine walked him through the architecture decisions that had defined ClearPath's core engine. She talked about what she had learned from the failed startup, specifically the lesson about building for a market that didn't yet know it needed the product, and what that had taught her about the relationship between technical vision and commercial timing. She talked about what she wanted to build next. By the end of it, Greg Sutton knew something he had not known walking into the room, what a genuinely senior technical candidate sounded like, in the full, unmediated version. He had been selecting for a particular sound and had been missing the actual signal. He submitted an interview feedback form that afternoon that was, in the language of NextBridge's structured review system, the most comprehensive technical evaluation he had filed in 4 years. The Director of Product Architecture position was offered to Josephine Alidad 11 days later. She accepted. She had also, in the 11 days between the interview and the offer, received 2 other offers. One from a San Francisco platform company that had contacted her directly after a colleague mentioned her name, and one from a venture-backed startup in Austin whose CTO had read her name in a ClearPath product review and reached out on LinkedIn with the directness of someone who did not want to lose the conversation. She had considered all 3. She chose NextBridge. Not because it was the most prestigious or the most lucrative, though it was neither the least of either. She chose it because the problem they were trying to solve in their data services division was the most technically interesting of the 3, and because the conversation with Greg Sutton, specifically the 37 minutes after the About panel, had suggested that there was genuine appetite for the kind of architectural thinking she brought, and that the appetite was real rather than performed. She had made 12 wrong choices for the right reasons in her career, and she had learned from all 12 to distinguish between the rooms that were ready to hear her and the rooms that thought they were. NextBridge, she decided, was ready. Her first week at NextBridge, Josephine asked to meet with the HR technology team, not to say anything about what had happened in the interview. She had no interest in relitigating the conference room. She asked because she wanted to understand how ClearPath was being configured and used across the company's hiring workflow, and what she found in 2 hours of conversation with the 3 people who managed the platform was what she always found when she looked carefully at how her software was deployed in the field. A gap between what the system was designed to do and what the people using it understood about it. specifically the bias reduction scoring layer. The feature she had built and that had won the 2019 award. It was not turned on. It had been purchased as part of the enterprise license. It had been in the system for 2 years. It had never been activated, because the configuration required a manual setup process that the HR team had not been trained on, and that nobody had prioritized. Josephine looked at the configuration screen. She had spent 3 months building that feature. She had argued internally at Meridian for the development resources to build it, because the research was clear that unstructured interview evaluation produced systematically biased outcomes, and the tool existed to address that. She had won the argument. She had built the feature. She had watched it become the platform's most cited selling point. She turned it on. It took 11 minutes. She walked the HR team through the configuration. She answered their questions. She sent them a documentation link and then, because the documentation was not as clear as it should have been, wrote them a supplementary guide in plain language that evening and sent it the next morning. Keisha, the young HR coordinator who had been in the room on interview day, was the one who emailed back. She said, "I've been looking at this feature for 2 years and never understood what it actually did until I read your guide. Thank you." Josephine replied, "It does what it says. Most features do. They just need someone to read them." She paused before sending. Then she added, "You noticed what happened in that interview. That matters. The system works better when the people using it pay that kind of attention." She sent it. Keisha read it 3 times. 6 months into her role at Nexbridge, Josephine had restructured the product architecture roadmap, begun rebuilding the data services platform's core module with a design philosophy that the CTO described to the board as the most coherent technical vision we've had in 6 years, and initiated a company-wide review of the hiring workflow that included an audit of how ClearPath's features were being used across all 12 regional offices. The audit found 4 offices where the bias reduction layer had never been activated, 2 where the scoring module was turned on but not configured, 1 where it had been configured incorrectly in a way that was producing systematic ranking distortions, the opposite of what the feature was designed to do. She fixed all of them. Not alone, she worked with each office's HR lead patiently and specifically, in the same way she had built software, understanding the end user, building for how they actually worked rather than how the documentation assumed they worked, and then checking whether it was working the way it was meant to. Greg Sutton stopped by her office one afternoon in month 3. Her door was open, she kept it open, had kept it open at every job she'd ever had, because she believed that accessible people produced better work than defended ones. He said the audit. The bias layer. "I've been thinking about the interview." She looked up from her screen. "I've been thinking about it too," she said. "I want to understand what I missed," he said. "Not just your name on the software, the process. What in the process made it possible for me to miss what I missed?" She looked at him for a moment. This was not the question she had expected from him. It was, in fact, a better question. She said, "Do you have an hour?" He did. She told him, carefully, the research on structured interview bias, the mechanics of pattern recognition, the specific ways that familiarity with certain trajectories shapes what interviewers hear and don't hear. She told him what ClearPath's bias reduction layer was designed to surface and how it worked when configured correctly. She told him that the feature he had in his system for 2 years was built specifically to address the gap in his process. He listened. He took notes. At the end of the hour, he said, "I want to run a training for the hiring managers. Would you be willing to lead it?" She said yes. The training ran the following month. 14 hiring managers, 2 HR directors, 3 regional leads. 2 hours. She built the curriculum in a week, the way she built everything, from first principles with the end user in mind, tested for clarity before delivery. Greg Sutton sat in the front row. He was one of the most attentive people in the room. The software had been there all along. That was the thing about it. Not that she had designed it and he hadn't known. Not even that he had used it every day without reading the name in the About panel. Those were facts. What they pointed to was the other thing, the thing that the bias reduction layer had been built to address, the gap between what a system is designed to see and what the people using it actually look for. Systems don't see. People see, and people see what they have been trained to look for, what they expect to find, what fits the pattern they have internalized across years of making decisions in environments that consistently rewarded a specific kind of recognition. Josephine had built a tool to help with that. She had also, in a glass-topped conference room in Dallas, demonstrated the gap more concisely than any training module could. In her office, on the credenza behind her desk, there was a framed printout. Not her name in the About panel, she had declined when someone offered to frame that. It was a single sentence, printed in a font she had chosen because it was readable without being decorative. On paper, she had cut to exactly the right size. It was the first line of the ClearPath HR design brief she had written in 2014, when she and Dr. Chen Liwai had sat down to define what they were building and why. A system is only as good as what it is designed to see. She had written that line at 30 years old. It was still true. She had been proving it ever since.